we take it seriously too. We don't like sending people to prison. We don't like seeing a crying mom in the gallery watching her son be sentenced to a crime. Like, it is heavy for everyone in there.
Kristyn, thank you so much for joining me today. Really glad to have you here.
Thank you for having me. Excited to be on it right now.
So, one of the reasons that I was dying to talk to you is not only because you are one of my very good friends, but also because we graduated school at the same time back in 2017. I went the defense attorney track and you became a prosecutor. So I think it's always interesting to see kind of both sides and both perspectives of that. So tell us a little bit how you got started and tell us what you're doing now.
Yeah. So I worked I'll start, I guess, while I was in law school. I did not want to be a prosecutor. Anytime anyone asks, like, what do you want to do with your degree? I was like, anything but criminal law, which was hilarious because 2 years later, I'm like, this is the only thing I want to do. But I kind of fell into an internship through a friend of a friend at the DA's office. And after taking criminal law and evidence my first 2 years, I was like, I actually really find this stuff interesting. So I was like, well, we'll give it a try. And got an internship with the DA's office in Milwaukee County. Worked there with the community prosecution and early intervention units, and which was very different than a lot of like traditional prosecution. And that's something that still to this day I love about that office. I think that it is a lot of really important work, and I really honestly felt honored to be working in that division. But you kind of got to see a lot of the criminal justice system in that way too, the good and the bad, more so than you do maybe in more of a traditional route. So really enjoyed working there, decided that it was kind of what I wanted to do, and then just jumped in head first, took internships at multiple district attorney's offices around the state. Another internship there, I did the prosecutor clinic through school, and I worked in the child protective advocacy unit, doing that for a year, as well as my law clerk job still with the other units. And once I graduated, it was kind of just like the easy next step for me. It was what I wanted to do. So luckily I got a job there and kind of just jumped in the day after graduation and started taking cases. But I started as a special prosecutor for the first about 3 months after, which is just different funded type of prosecutor. I was covering for someone on maternity leave. And I took a spot at the Child Protection Advocacy Unit for those few months, and then was hired on as a staff member later in September, and started with the general misdemeanor unit. Did that for a few months, and then went on to general felonies and stayed there until I ended up leaving that office and moved across the country to California. Took some time off to take the bar and ended up getting stuck in COVID world. And so everything with the bar was very delayed. So I worked at a restaurant in the meantime. I was the general manager there. Much different experience.
But still client customer service, there's a lot of parallels there.
It's true. And it was fun. It was a nice break, especially after dealing with a lot of really heavy stuff for a while.
Sure.
It was definitely a nice break, and studied for the bar, took the bar, passed the bar, then worked at a district attorney's office in Solano County in California. And it's a little bit north of the Bay Area, a little south of Sacramento. Worked there for a little over a year and ended up moving again. So we are now in North Carolina. It's our official, hopefully stay forever state. Started a family, took some time off, did some doc review in the meantime, and now I work as an associate attorney at a healthcare law firm. So much different than prosecution, but it's been a fun journey to get here, and I'm enjoying it so far.
Awesome. Well, one of the things that I wanted to ask you, because it's so exciting for me to pick the brain of a prosecutor. I think there's a lot of misconceptions about how criminal cases start, right? From the public perception. There's this idea that, if somebody wants to press charges, that will automatically mean that a case is going to go forward. So what can you tell us about the process of when a referral from law enforcement hits your desk? Like, what does that look like from your perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is a very good point. It is something that is such a huge misconception when it comes to law enforcement and prosecution. A lot of people say, I'm pressing charges, or I talk to the police and they're pressing charges. And to be clear for everyone, people who are victims of crimes, unfortunately, you are not the ones pressing charges, although you can say that you want to be involved in prosecution or not. And same thing with police officers. They are not the ones who are pressing charges, but they are the ones that will bring the case forward to a prosecutor. So then it comes on our desk, and every office does it a little bit different on how you go through the charging process. But for example, I interned in one office where they got police reports and they decided off of that. Another office where you got to meet with the officer and the victim, and another office that was kind of like a hybrid of both. But yeah, a case comes through my desk. We get everything that's available to us at the time. So that's often going to be police reports, body cams, any interviews that have happened, any in custody interviews that have happened, dash cam. And we have the opportunity to say, hey, we need some more information before we go forward on this. Or we have everything we need right now. But, there's been many times that I'm like, hey, can you go check for maybe security cameras in the area, or go see if you can talk to this specific person? Or, I would like to talk to this specific person. And I think that's a really big thing too, is in this line of work, you talk to a lot of people and it's so important. There's many times where I've talked to a victim of a crime before charging a case, and you kind of feel it out of, does their story match up? Is it credible? Do I have follow-up questions for you? Same thing with other witnesses. And sometimes I've talked to, a suspect prior to charging a case too. And sometimes it leads in other resolutions. Sometimes it leads in, charging a case. But we try to get like the biggest picture that we can get. And one of my fellow coworkers that I learned so much from, always said, like, your case isn't going to get better after charging. I mean, like, there's things that maybe we can get, but we want to get all of that stuff right up front. So we really have the clearest picture of the case, because you don't want to charge someone with a crime unnecessarily, or find out later that it wasn't them, or everyone was lying and now we have all this other accounts that show that they were. So that's kind of how it comes forward onto my desk. And then we get to make a choice of, charging, not charging, maybe trying to find more information. Or if there's, other opportunities to do something else with the case, like an early intervention, things that we call like diversion. So like a pre-charge where, hey, we want you to pay some restitution, then we're not going to charge this case. Pay the victim back. We won't charge you. Or, you know what, I think maybe you could just benefit from some community service, and then we're not going to charge this case. Stuff like that. But yes, so there can be victims, witnesses, officers can recommend charges, but really it's not up to them at the end. And we always say that in order to charge a case, we want to be able to prove that case. We want to be able to be confident in our decision and say, I can prove this case beyond a reasonable doubt to 12 jurors of this person's peers before we move forward with charging a case.
Yeah. And so, one of the other things that a lot of people might not know is that prosecutors have a special ethical duty when it comes to charging cases and going forward with cases. What can you tell us about that? And how is that a little bit different than, for example, I see my role as zealously advocating for my client, and I have to, obviously the client makes the choice of if they want to enter a plea or go to trial. But beyond that, I'm doing everything I can to get us from point A to point B. How is that a little bit different for you when you were in a prosecutorial role, in terms of the considerations that you had to think about?
Yeah, I think that it is that wanting to have the big picture. And like you said, prosecutors do have a higher standard. We have a higher standard than, other attorneys, because there are attorney code of conduct, but there's also, prosecutorial code of conduct as well. And that's a little bit higher than the normal attorney standard, because we need to make sure that, this is someone's life, liberty, property, whatever it may be. And we want to make sure that we are making the best decision possible. So that is looking at everything. That is, saying, can I prove this beyond a reasonable doubt? And it's not always about, and this is another, big misconception. And when it comes to trials, when it comes to charging anywhere along the line, is it's not always, did this person do it? There's times where I'm like, I mean, probably, but can I prove that beyond a reasonable doubt? No, I can't, because that's our standard that we have to live up to. It's not, when you're going to trial, it's not, did this person do it? And I think a lot of jurors will get caught up in that too, of like, well, obviously he did it, but did I prove the case? Did I prove to you every element of the crime beyond a reasonable doubt? So that's something that is very very high standard to reach. And that's something that's important when we are charging cases. And I think, I've had the honor of working with some amazing prosecutors, and that's something that everyone that I've worked with takes very seriously, because we do understand the gravity of our role in the system. And, not every case gets charged. In fact, maybe half of the cases get charged because there's not enough evidence, or like I said, we can't prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. And sometimes that's very frustrating, especially it comes to a lot of, he said, she said cases. And it's like, I believe you. I believe what you're saying, but can I prove it? No, I can't, which is, unfortunate sometimes, but that standard is there for a reason, as it should be.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I get frustrated with is, and I appreciate you saying that, because there absolutely are some prosecutors that are really thoughtful about the job, and I think have the courage to say, I've got a problem with my case. Like, I don't think I can go forward with it. And I have a lot of respect for that. There are other folks, and, I practice all over the state, so I see really different approaches and policies depending on the office and depending on who you're working with. There's some places where, folks will double down on it, even if it's a case where it's like, okay, like, the frustration becomes, you've now taken a case and kind of left it up to a jury, wherein we're spending a lot of resources to do this. There's a lot of time. If you have issues with witnesses, or, there's other investigations that, we do on our end, and I come to you and I say, hey, here's what's going on. I certainly appreciate when a prosecutor is willing to listen. They may not agree with me all the time, but at least to be able to have that conversation, I think does so much more for all of the parties involved, rather than needing to be purely adversarial all the time, because I don't think that really gets anybody where we need to go. And the system as it is, from having worked in Milwaukee County, it can take an incredibly long period of time to get your case to trial. When we're talking about how many cases are there, and then we're talking about folks that are in custody or have speedy demands in, like, it doesn't, justice is a slow process. So I think one of the things that you touched on earlier is the early intervention program. That's one of the things I really like about Milwaukee County. Different counties have similar programs, but they may not be formal. Some of them are, and they all kind of look a little bit different. But can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I think sometimes there are situations where we're talking about people that are young, that may not have a record. If we can get them involved in some sort of programming, like you mentioned, everybody might be better off, including somebody that's coming to your office from the position of, somebody that's a complaining witness in your case, and, the community as a whole. If we can figure out a way to make that person whole, and perhaps pursue treatment or other things. So can you tell us a little bit about, early intervention and what that looks like?
Yeah. So just as a side note, I've been out of Milwaukee for about 5 years now. So grain of salt if there's anything that has changed, but in my experience, so the early intervention, it holds separate courts. So it's, one judge that presides over the early intervention courts. And those are, once a deferred prosecution agreement is entered, and I'll get into that, but once that's entered, then it transfers to that court. If it's a drug treatment court, that goes to that court. A veterans treatment court, that goes to that court. So there's a lot of things that just go kind of funneled into that court, and those people are trained differently and really understand more about, trauma-informed care, and a lot of more in-depth problems of the community than maybe other judges are, or other, even defense attorneys, because there are a lot of, or prosecutors, there's a team that specializes in that court. And that team meets, and it is very collaborative. I used to sit in on those meetings, and it's like, what can we be doing to help this person? And obviously, as a prosecutor, we also are looking at helping the victim if it's a victim case. But it's helping the victim, be made whole. It's helping the community, and it's helping that person. The point is to try to prevent that person from committing a crime again, from getting the resources that they need. So in Milwaukee County, and I think this is honestly a problem most places, but we see it a lot in Milwaukee County, is there is a lot of drugs. There's definitely a drug pandemic, and sometimes for those individuals, it's not about punishing them for using drugs. It's about helping them. And not every crime is eligible, and there's some, violent crimes that are dealt with in a different way. But if someone is, stealing because of their addiction, then do we want to put them in jail for 15 days and then have them come out and go straight back to that store and steal again? Is that helpful? No. Is it more helpful to get them the treatment that they need and to get clean, or to get, some sort of therapy? I think one thing that we saw so much success with was the cognitive behavioral therapy and people going through that. And, I've seen many clients been like, thank you so much. This really helped me, because now I learned how to deal with my trauma or my triggers, whatever it may be. I was put in a bad situation recently, and I learned how to make a good decision based off of that. And stuff like that is like, it's heartwarming, because it's like, that's what you want, because you don't want anyone to have a life of crime or a life of drugs, or just like not fulfilling their potential. And you see so much potential in people. And I know you obviously know that, being a defense attorney, because you're sitting next to them every day. So there's a lot of treatment aspect to it. And some of it's very strict, and some of it, is inpatient treatment, some of it's outpatient. But there's like a variety of different services that they provide, which is great. We also do, so I mentioned like the deferred prosecution, or a DPA, which is an agreement that's entered. So it's a case is charged normally, and then, more normally at the outset, we'll look at it and be like, this is probably appropriate for a DPA. But sometimes it's, the defense attorney advocating and say, hey, I think my client would be really great for this. And it's an agreement saying, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, and then my case will either get reduced or dismissed at the end of this agreement term. A lot of that is staying out of trouble, no new crimes or arrests, maybe staying clean, maybe doing a certain amount of community service, maybe paying back restitution. And then there's the diversion, which is like a pre-charge agreement. So if you do all of this stuff in a certain amount of time, then your case isn't going to get charged. And I see a lot of younger people on those, or like lower level crimes too. It's the amount of times that I've seen a victim come in and be like, I don't want this person to get charged with crime and go through the system. I don't necessarily want to take my time out to be, a witness in this case and have to testify. And, but I just kind of want my money back. And we do it where it's like, okay, pay them their money back, and we're not going to charge your case. And I think, one thing for me personally that is, I think, frustrating and hard to see in the system is how a lot of our youth are treated. And I truly believe that when it comes to youth victims, youth offenders, like there's so many services that these people can really benefit from, to not then, be starting their long rap sheet at 17 or 18 years old. So a lot of those, lower level crimes that go through that, I feel like are very helpful for those individuals to not reoffend. And I don't know what the numbers are these days, but
Sure.
I think it was something like 75%, and I guess don't quote me on that, of individuals after 5 years or 10 years when they were doing the study did not reoffend. So it's like, that's a really great success rate.
Yeah, I think one of the things that is difficult, I think, sometimes for the general public, because the general public has attitudes about crime and the social determinants of all of those things, and whatever the case may be, right? I think unless you work in the system, whether, somebody that's kind of adjacent to the criminal law system, somebody that's in it, whether or not we're talking about, partners like Justice Point, like all those different agencies, right? Like, it's hard to understand, I think, to some extent, why people should get a second chance or another opportunity. But a lot of times, like you said, there are certain types of crimes that tend to be crimes that are related to poverty or lack of resources, other things like substance abuse that you talked about as well, that when we're looking at how do we keep our community safe and how do we improve things for everybody, there are things that can be done that can be effective without stigmatizing somebody, especially at that age, at a very young age, with a criminal record. Because I'm sure, as you've seen, I mean, going through life with the cards stacked against you in a lot of ways, it becomes increasingly more difficult when you're looking for jobs, when you're looking for housing, if you have a criminal record, not to mention getting a first felony on your record. So I know for me, a lot of times when I have clients that have either never been in trouble before, and we're talking about, low-level felonies and misdemeanors, I mean, I always want to try to see if we can avoid that conviction if the circumstances make sense, because the collateral consequences are so far-reaching. And I'm sure that that's something, that you're aware of too. So I think that's something that the general public doesn't always understand. And you see kind of the keyboard warriors on Facebook when the news puts out a post on a particular case. And that can become frustrating, I'm sure, from both sides, just because of, how misinformation can spread about cases or even about the facts, right? Because you'll see reporters post things and that's like, well, yes, that gets a headline, but that's not exactly what that means or what that, what the outcome is or whatever the case is. But you'll see people get really confused by that. So, yeah, I just think that's an interesting dynamic. What would you say was? Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'm cutting you off.
I think it's like something too that a lot of people, and I understand completely, I live in the same society that the rest of us do, is that people want people who commit crimes to take accountability. And, I absolutely agree. You do something wrong, you have to take accountability for that. And that's the only way we're going to grow as people and as a society. And, not every crime is eligible for this kind of thing. And not every crime should be. But also, not every punishment, fits the crime, or not every punishment is appropriate. So I see a lot of, especially for younger people, and I think that's a big group of people that you want to be able to learn how to take accountability at a younger age. And I see that happening a lot in these, again, lower level crimes, on these diversions and other agreements, because they learn that they kind of have to take accountability by paying that restitution or by doing whatever. And you know what? If they don't, then their case gets charged and they go through the criminal justice system normally if they don't want to take accountability the normal way. But a lot of times I feel like a lot of people reflect on, what they did a lot more in those situations. And there's a lot of people who are really grateful for that opportunity. And by that, they're like, you know what? I was wrong here and I'm going to make it right. And I appreciate that. Again, that's not everyone. Some people are like, I'm never showing up to these meetings. I'm not doing what you want me to do. And then, you know what? Their case gets charged. And that's what happens.
Yeah. I mean, I think you can only provide the tools, and then if somebody chooses to take advantage of that, great. But I mean, it's something that I run into too, is that I can work as hard as I want to try to tee up an agreement that I think is a really good one, but that's all I can do. I can't make somebody do that. So I mean, that is an interesting dynamic, and I think I just wish that people, I think, knew a little bit more about the usefulness of some of these programs, because it's not about letting people skate by without accountability. It's about the cost benefit and kind of weighing, like, is this a situation that really requires us to use judicial resources, go through that whole process? And it's not just from the perspective of the person accused, right? I mean, there's considerations about, your victims, your witnesses, like all those other people that are part of the system too, that again, are kind of taken into consideration. So I just think that's really interesting. And it's something that I wish more people knew about, because it tends to be like this black and white picture, right? Like it's either, it's like, No, there's a lot of gray areas and there's a lot of in between. I want to talk to you a little bit about, from your perspective, what were some of the differences in how prosecuting looked like in California versus Wisconsin? Because I think, states, even though, yes, we have the same federal law in general, like Supreme Court law, right? There's a lot of differences in terms of how states actually deal with cases in their criminal systems. So tell me a little bit about that. What was that like for you to kind of adjust?
It was very different. I I think one really big difference that I saw was how drugs were treated. A lot of the cases in Wisconsin are, felonies, and most of them, yeah, I'd say a lot of them that we dealt with were misdemeanors, and not only were they misdemeanors, they were diversion cases.
Okay.
So even, heroin, which is like a big deal in Milwaukee, and
Yeah.
it is treated like a diversion in California, or not charged at all. So that was a really big difference for me. And we also dealt with a lot of um, homelessness, and obviously I know that that's an issue in Wisconsin too. Any major city, but like California is definitely kind of like off the charts when it comes to that. So that was hard. But in terms of prosecution, it was definitely way more lenient. I think as a prosecutor, it was really frustrating for me in a lot of senses because things weren't charged a lot. And, I'm not saying you have to charge every case, but there's definitely a lot of things that I guess in my experience or things that, we'd see. I would have a stack of files like you can't even see on the camera that big for the same person. So it's
Wow.
like, well, what we're doing is not working, because they just keep
Sure.
coming back in every single day. So it's like, well, at what point do we charge? I also felt that there was a lot of less justice for victims um, in general. I Yeah, there was a lot of differences. There's definitely a lot less mandatory minimums. Right when I was leaving too, the laws changed quite a bit, and there was a new bill, and there's constantly new bills for even like less punishment for gun crimes. That was a big one too. And so where I worked was definitely one of the more violent counties in the entire state. Um, so it was kind of shocking to me where there was a lot of, a lot of gun crime, and there was just not, consequences for that. Where it'd be like, 2 days time served, you're good. And for like felon in possession and people that would come back with like 5 felon in possessions, it's like one case would go and 4 would get dismissed, and you would do 2 days time served. And there was a lot. I think that there was a lot of good intentions on a lot of stuff, but maybe laws made by people who have never worked or have been around the criminal justice system to see how they actually, go into play. Like there's a lot of focus on mental health and trauma. And, I think as a prosecutor, and most prosecutors think that, those things should be focused on, they should be helped. And we're not trying to punish mental health, but there also needs to be a line. There needs to be, then fine, then let's help these people instead of just being like, hey, mental health problem. Sorry they stabbed someone. Have a good day, So
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of frustration in that way. One thing that I thought was great, they have a crime victim compensation board. So victims of crimes can apply for restitution before even like their case goes to court or gets prosecutor. Because as you know, sometimes it's 2 years and the person that just got $20,000 stolen from them is now living on the streets because they can't afford to live. But the crime victim compensation, they will reimburse the victim for that money. And then the defendant will have to then, once the case goes through, will have to then pay restitution to the board and not to the victim. So I was like, I think that's one thing for someone who's very like, I'm very victim minded, when it comes to a lot of stuff. So I liked that. But yeah, there was definitely a lot of stark differences. And even because I worked in a more rural area of Wisconsin for my internship, and then versus Milwaukee, and like those are two drastically different.
What county were you in? Was it
Sheboygan?
I was going to say Sheboygan or Washington. I couldn't remember.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes, Sheboygan. I was there for a semester, and like how that worked was a lot different than Milwaukee. And then versus, so it was like, more prosecution, and then it was like just going up the less prosecution. But it was a very different experience.
Milwaukee is like its own thing too. Like, I mean, compared to the rest of the state of Wisconsin, Milwaukee is just so unique just in terms of population density. Like all of the issues, like there isn't really, it's just apples and oranges compared to even some of the other metropolitan areas in Wisconsin are not like Milwaukee County. And so I think that office in particular, whether we're talking about the PD's office there or the DA's office, is just a very unique kind of subset of, what the criminal law system looks like in our state. Just because, I mean, you can go up to, I took a case up in Shawano County. I had to think about it. So Shawano and Menominee are like a shared county because a lot of it is tribal land. So they have a combined county prosecutor's office. So I couldn't remember which one it was. But I say that to say, I mean, they've got like one prosecutor, one assistant, ton of cases. They're so backlogged. And there are a lot of other counties like that in those rural areas where they just don't have enough people to work those cases, and it becomes an issue on both sides of things. But they're also seeing those issues in Milwaukee as well, and more urban areas. I guess my other question is, did you see the same kinds of, I guess, issues in terms of having lawyer shortages when you worked out in California? Is that an issue that you would consider to be like a nationwide issue, or is that unique to us here?
Yeah, I think it was definitely worse in Wisconsin because I know turnover was so high. And part of it was when I was there, the pay for prosecutors was insanely low. And I know it's gone up a little bit since, but it's still, I mean, for the amount of weight that's on your shoulders every single day, I feel like it's so crazy to me, like how little prosecutors get paid. And it's hard because, like you said, the shortage, and that's not good for anyone because you don't want an overworked prosecutor who doesn't have time to truly look at a case, be the one charging the case or going through with the case. Like the defendant doesn't want that. That's not fair to that person. It's not fair to the victims. It's not fair to anyone around. So I think that was a really big challenge, is that there was a lot of really young prosecutors that joined the office. And then once they kind of got to that level of like, maybe wanting to start a family or buy a house or like have things in their life that cost money, then they have to start looking for their jobs because they need more money. So you have a lot of older prosecutors and younger prosecutors with no one in between.
Yeah.
I think California was a little bit better. The pay was better, but of course it's California, so the cost of living is so much higher. Sure. But definitely still turnover. On both sides too. And I think it was kind of frustrating all around because I don't think a lot of things in California are run the best. And
I think a lot of people would agree with that.
From prosecutors. What was that?
I said I think a lot of people would agree with that.
Sorry, throwing California under the bus, but
well, that's okay. You're in North Carolina now, so
yeah, I know I'm well gone. Although I still technically work in California, but it's fine. But it just, prosecutors and defense attorneys alike, they were frustrated with a lot of things that would happen because your goal might be different than my goal, and none of the goals are being met. So I think people just got kind of frustrated with the job in general. And because there are, so many cases, and like look at bigger cities like San Francisco or that whole area, it's like especially with COVID, it was, things were so crowded and cases were so backlogged that things just got dismissed. And there was 100,000 people that just got released. And because no one was there to take the case or handle it or space for anyone. So
Well, one thing that you said that was really interesting, and I have thought about this too as an issue, is this gap between you've got a lot of really young prosecutors and a lot of senior prosecutors that are more so folks probably inching towards retirement or they're in the very top of the letterhead, right? But you don't see as many in that intermediate level that quite honestly have the experience, right, to be able to triage cases, to be able to have maybe a little bit more judgment when it comes to prosecutorial discretion than the folks who are just starting out. But on the other hand, you've now kind of got, well, we've got to move people in these spots as quickly as possible because we have all these cases. And so one of the things that I get frustrated about is I think the lack of discretion, which prosecutors certainly have, in that younger tier of attorneys. And I think I understand why, right? When you're young, you don't want to make a mistake. You don't want to screw something up and you're concerned about that. And over time, you learn to triage cases differently. You learn to approach things differently. And that just comes with experience. But when you've got folks that are starting out and you don't have as many people in that, 7, 8, 9-year range, right? That's kind of in that intermediate phase. I do think that can not only create issues with staffing, because I understand it, if on both the PD side and the prosecutor side, I mean, yes, there's the student loan forgiveness, which is great, but beyond that, I could see why a lot of times people would want to leave to do private practice jobs for whatever reason, right? I think it creates kind of a vacuum and this gap where you've got folks that we really need to be working these cases that just aren't there. And so, that's kind of a challenge because how do you train then the more younger, how do you train the younger assistant prosecutors? Like how do you deal with that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there is such a gap there. And then when everyone's overworked and busy, then it's hard to find people to take the time away from their busy schedule than to train you. I feel like I was very lucky because one, I worked there for 2 years before I started. So I had definitely like a good base of knowledge before starting. And I had some really great team captains along the way too. So I feel like I probably got more training than the average person, but like starting out a misdemeanor court is just crazy. And not all the misdemeanor judges either are there to help you. Sometimes a more experienced judge will be in that role and they're able to kind of help you learn along the way, which I know it's not necessarily their job, but you kind of, you learn from their expertise of running a courtroom. And, but when you have younger judges, it's like kind of everyone's like in this whole world of like, we have no idea what's happening. And then especially because you have a lot of younger, public defenders too, that are in your courtroom. A lot of us graduated at the same time. So it's just, it is tricky in that sense. I think my office in California did a really good job of training. We had a lot of oversight for a long time, even in felonies, when it came to offers, amending things, charging, like in misdemeanor charging, all of my charging decisions went through my supervisor for quite some time just to, double check. But I think in the places that I've worked, there's been a lot of collaboration. And like I said, I was really lucky with some really great teams where the amount of times that I just come sit in my team captain's office and be like, okay, let's talk through this case. And they would do it to me too, because sometimes you need a second pair of ears and someone removed from the case to tell you like, no, that's a bad case. You're like, no, you're good, or trial strategy or whatever it is. But I feel like that's something that I kind of see everywhere is that like that missing chunk of people that are kind of in the middle. Yeah. And I don't really know how to fix that other than pay people what they deserve.
I mean, it's hard to, because I will tell you, I mean, like, so starting out in like a private firm, but like a bigger sized private firm. I mean, we had like 6 or 7 attorneys there, which like for a small firm is fairly sizable, right? Like you always had somebody that you could talk to, you know, even if it wasn't like a partner, there were other associates there that you could talk to that have been doing it longer than you. I, you know, recently took my first foray into being a supervisor, and that was so challenging because it's completely different than practicing law. And so I've now taken from that and realized that, you know, here's what I'm good at, here's what I need to get better at. But I think you probably like me, whereas you were somebody that started out and you just like jumped into the job. And like there's going to be people that are good at the job, there's going to be people that are bad at the job on both sides, right? I mean, you're always going to have that no matter what profession you're in. But I know that like you would be working so late because I would get, you know, snaps from you in like the dungeons of the Milwaukee County Safety Building or wherever you were, because you were literally working that late on cases. And so I think your particular drive and work ethic absolutely is directly related to you being as successful as you were and kind of getting that level of responsibility early on, for sure.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I truly thought that when I was in the prosecutor's office that I had found my calling, and I felt very lucky because I know a lot of people don't ever find that in their lifetime when it comes to a job or career. And it was something I genuinely enjoyed doing, and I do miss it. I think that with my time as a prosecutor, I kind of got a little burnt out towards the end. But I mean, my main reason for not going back is I started a family. And for me, that was really hard. Like my brain changed when I had a kid, and having to deal with all of that heaviness every day is something that I was like, I don't think I can do this anymore. So, and I'll probably go back at some point, maybe, who knows, 30 years from now. But I just feel like I'm very happy where I am now, which is good. But it does take a big emotional toll, and it really can on a lot of people. So like, you know, it's hard work. It's hard emotionally. And it's just one of those jobs too, where it's like, you never have nothing to do.
Yeah.
It's like, you always have something. You go home from work and you're thinking about work, and you know, it's just one of those jobs that I think can lead to burnout pretty easily, especially when you're not taking care of yourself, which I think is a problem with a lot of young attorneys.
Yeah, for sure.
So you know, I know so many people who have been burnt out from whatever job they are as a young attorney, because it's like you're burning the candle at both ends. You really want to make a name for yourself, and there's a lot of expectations, and there's a lot of pressure too. You know, you're dealing with, no matter what kind of law you're doing, you're dealing with something that affects someone else. So it's a lot. But
I think what you said is really on point. Like there's something about this job and working in the criminal field that is really heavy, and I don't think we always realize how heavy it is until you like have a moment to slow down, because there's a lot of difficult stuff that we're dealing with, like heavy topics, serious stuff. I mean, yeah, there is some stuff that is pretty minimal. There's also stuff that's pretty serious. I deal with a lot of DV cases, and some of them are not pretty. There are others that are, you know, the kinds of cases like you said that are, you know, mostly just he said, she said stories without a lot of corroborating evidence. And so that's maybe easier to handle, right? But as you, I think, over time take on more cases, particularly more violent cases, it's hard to like separate that. When you said that you like taking your hiatus as the GM of a restaurant, like that, I totally get that, because I used to be in the service industry too, like during law school and before. And there's an aspect about it. It's like, I come, I do my job, I check out, like I'm done after my shift. And you don't get that anymore in this job. And it's always something. And so I think you're absolutely right that young attorneys, I mean, really all attorneys, like have to make time to take care of themselves. And I've always said that you cannot be the best for your client or whoever you're advocating for, right? You cannot be the best person for your client if you don't take care of yourself, because at some point you just can't do it anymore. So I think that the state bar, at least here, is trying to come up with some initiatives. I still think there's a huge stigma talking about any kind of like mental health or stress or just admitting that you're like, hey, I need a break. Like we're lawyers, we're litigators. We're not supposed to like take a break. And there's a badge of honor in being in the trenches all the time, right? So it's like, those are aspects where I know that younger generations of attorneys are kind of turning the tide on that because they have completely different expectations for, a work-life balance. On the other hand, there is an aspect that this job, like you just kind of have to put in the work. Like that's not going to change. So I really appreciate, other people sharing that idea because for a long time it was something that you would say, maybe to your colleagues, but you're not publicly going to say like, yeah, burnout is a real thing. And if you keep going a million miles an hour, it's going to happen. So
yeah, it's tough. I've definitely been there with the burnout and like fast too. It can come so fast. Like I probably was a year in before I was like mental breakdown status
because like how many cases did you have like on any given day? Like when you were in misdemeanor court, I mean, I don't know if people totally understand like how many cases you had.
Our calendar would be, I don't know, a couple hundred a day. When I was without a court partner, I had 1,200 cases myself.
Yeah.
So in felonies, it's obviously less,
right?
Because it's, more serious stuff, less crimes, whatever, but it probably around 90 to 100 ish.
Yeah.
So, and that's the thing, like that you say, like you want to take time for yourself, but it's hard in a job like this because, like I said, there's always something to do, and you not doing something means hurting someone else.
Right.
So, like, I don't file the motion I'm supposed to. I don't prep for jury trial. Like there's just always stakes. There's not a lot of tasks at the job that if you don't do it, and we're professionally licensed, so you have, you can't miss something. Like you could get the ethics board called on you or something if you're just like, I'm gonna phone it in today, or like you're constantly even being aware of every word that you say during the day, and that is exhausting. I think too, like the adversarial system in and of itself is exhausting, and not every person that you work with is is adversarial nature, but it is the concept of the work is. And like sometimes, it's like I walk into a courtroom, and I'm the most hated person in the room right now. And I've definitely had, I think it was more so in California than Milwaukee, but it was very, very adversarial in California, where the defense bar didn't want to say hi to you when you walked into the room. And I'd always walk in and be like, hi, good morning. And everyone just glares at you and you're like, okay, sorry for existing.
Well, it's weird. It's weird that you say that too, because like early on, like I, had conversations with like my first boss about kind of, who also came from a prosecutor background too, like, because of the adversarial nature of it, like there are certain optics. And I feel like from the defense perspective, it's like, I'm very aware of how my client will perceive any interaction like with a prosecutor. I don't want them to ever think that like, because people say like, oh, like I think the defense and the state are working together. Right. Like, and, you try to be mindful of that. I remember one particular instance when this was many years ago. And I was waiting on a plea and sentencing on a felony OWI case. And obviously for that kind of a case, the client would have to go into custody right away after, sentencing. So that being said, he walks into court being out of custody, like waiting for that moment, right? Which is very stressful. And I remember, and it was a prosecutor that I didn't know super well, but like I had known her in passing, and she like comes up and sits to me and shows me all these pictures of like her cat and like these memes. And I was like, hey, like, I don't want to be rude to you, but like my client and his mom are sitting over there and we are the only people like giggling and chit chatting. Like, please don't take offense to this, but like, I just don't want him to get any particular, feeling about what, the nature of our relationship was. And so I think she was a little upset or like taken aback by that, but I try to like put myself in that position. But that being said, I really don't think there's a reason. I think I saw a phrase somewhere that said adversarial, but not asshole. Like, unless you make me be that way, like I try not to go into it that way, because I honestly think, if you can have open dialogues and conversations with prosecutors and defense attorneys, realistically, like, that credibility, I think, will get you further than just like slamming your briefcase down and, like, doing that whole song and dance. Like, I don't know if that's your perspective as well, but I think there's got to be kind of a give and take on that end.
This is like the part of where TV shows are not realistic when it comes to that. Is, it's very, like, it is adversarial nature and it is very serious. And like, I just, do want to impress upon like everyone that we take it seriously too. We don't like sending people to prison. We don't like seeing a crying mom in the gallery watching her son be sentenced to a crime. Like, it is heavy for everyone in there. But having a good relationship with prosecutors and defense attorneys, like, I could shout this from the rooftop, and me and my colleagues have talked about this so many times, is like, you will get so much further because you are privy to so much more information than we are when it comes to your client and what they have done to mitigate the offense, who they are as a person, why did they do what they did. There's so many other things. You get to know them as a person where we don't as much. And, we're just on different sides. And there's been so many times when I've asked a defense attorney of like, before we are coming up with an agreement or whatever, that it's like, hey, so what, especially like take an OWI, for example. It's like, have they done any treatment since? Like, this was a really high BAC and look at, it's their fourth. So there's clearly issues or whatever it may be. But it's like, have they done treatment? Have they, done any restitution, anything like that? And I have so many people be like, I'm not gonna tell you that. And it's like, but why though? There's things, it would be the most frustrating thing to me as a prosecutor, sitting through a sentencing argument and hearing the defense attorney say all of these things that would have made a difference. Especially cases where I'm recommending incarceration and they're recommending probation. But it's like, you never told me why you were recommending probation or why you wanted that. And if you would have told me all of those things that you just told the judge, I would have said, yeah, that sounds great. Like, we can work together. And I think that's so important, like having these good relationships, especially when it's like you said, the credibility. It's like, I can trust your word. There's also a lot of defense attorney out there be like, my client did this or whatever. And it's like, that person has never met his client.
Yeah.
Or, definitely had defense attorneys like that. It's like, you don't even know what he looks like. You've never met him before, or whatever.
And it's like, there are some cases we are never going to agree with. And those are trial cases. And I get it. Like, I get it. Like, there are going to be some kinds of cases that like it's just, we're not going to meet somewhere in the middle. And that's okay. Right. But at the end of the day, at the end of the day, it's like, I know that I will have to continue working with you. Right. And I will have other cases where that relationship, I think, matters. Right. So, I think there's a level of like collegiality that can actually be a really good thing. So, well, I have to go because I have to go to court. So I will give you the ending spiel. Well, Kristyn, thank you so much for coming on to talk. I'm sure we could talk for hours. I appreciate your time and thank you.
Thank you. Keep fighting the good fight. Enjoy court today. Go do some justice.
Absolutely.